Bonjour, good afternoon. My name is Daniel Belin, and I'm the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. And I welcome you to this lecture by our friend, Professor Chris Kirkey. And this is a lecture that actually is the culmination of our graduate research workshop, and we have quite a few of our graduate students who are here with us, who participated in the workshop earlier today, and we have some of our regular friends and new faces as well, people from outside the university, and also some of our faculty members. I would like to begin by acknowledging that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. It is important to us at McGill to recognize the significance of the land on which we live, study and work, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, which is known as MISC, is the Centre for Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies here at McGill. We support a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the country's past, present, and future. In addition to our academic programs in Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies, we also host public events such as this presentation today. And we tend to have, discussions about a wide range of topics. And if you want to learn more about our institute, you go to mcgill.ca/MISC, M-I-S-C. It is my great pleasure to welcome an old friend, and a friend of MISC, not just of me personally. This is the Christopher Kirkey will deliver the 2023-2024 BMP Lecture. And this lecture is part of the BMP Rotating Lecture Program in Canadian Studies, which was established a decade ago. And it's a formal partnership among the Canadian Studies programs at McGill, Bridgewater State University, and SUNY College at Plattsburgh. The lectureship is designed to strengthen connections between the programs, share expertise in the area of Canadian Studies, and expand audiences and interest in the field. Our speaker today, Christopher Kirkey, is director of the Centre for the Study of Canada and the Institute on Quebec Studies at the State University of New York at Plattsburgh. As a scholar of comparative foreign policy and international relations theory, he has been a professor at Bridgewater State University and Columbia University, and has been at SUNY Plattsburgh since 2002. His most recent work with Richard Nimijan is The Construction of Canadian Identity from Abroad, which was published in 2022, and he has previously served as president of the Association for Canadian Studies in the United States and the Middle Atlantic and New England Council on Canadian Studies. Welcome, Chris. Bienvenue à Montréal, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Merci beaucoup. Bonjour à tous. It's my great pleasure to be here at McGill today in Montreal. Wonderful city. It was my city. I grew up not far from here in Ontario. And this was when anything was happening, when you were a teenager or whatever, you came to Montreal to experience it. So, and I've seen a lot and done a lot in Montreal, and it's wonderful that when I came back to SUNY Plattsburgh in 2002 from Massachusetts, I had the wonderful opportunity to reacquaint myself with the city, with McGill, and so on. I remember I drove up one night to have dinner with a professor, good, long-standing from Université de Laval, Louis Balthazar, and I met him down by Bon Secours Market, and I got out of the car and it was freezing cold, I mean really cold, and my heart was pounding, and I couldn't understand why my heart was pounding. I thought I was having a heart attack, and I realized, no, you're back home. That's why you're feeling this way. So once again, thank you very much. If I might also share one small story at the outset here of a before going into my remarks. A number of years ago, I was asked to give the Distinguished Canadian Address at the University College of London. And a friend of mine who runs that program, gathered an audience, much like today. And, but before the talk, we had a reception. So we had wine to start with and everything, and I was watching, being very cautious. And I said to Tony before I went up for my remarks, I said, so how long would you like me to speak? And he said, about 40 minutes. And I said, that's perfect. I said, I can certainly do that. So I spoke that day. And there are some days as a professor, you have what they call your A game. And there's other days when you're not really that sharp and it's kind of general and fuzzy and you're not as compelling as you otherwise should be. Well, that day I had my A game. I knew that. And I just was a thoroughly fulsome, comprehensive overview of whatever the hell I was talking about. Anyhow, so after the talk, of course, there's questions and answers, followed by another reception, this time with more wine and food. And then following that, there was a dinner. And for several of us, and Tony pulled me aside for a sec, and he says, Chris, I just wanted to mention something to you. And I said, what's that? He said, great talk, good focus and everything. But he said, a couple of people in the audience complained because you were only 37 and a half minutes. And I said, really? I said, I never heard that before. So it really, I'll try and hit the 40-minute mark, Daniel, today, but I can't promise you. So it was interesting that people were actually a little bit felt like they were shortchanged because I didn't go the full 40. But anyhow, we'll see where we go today. Thank you, Daniel, for your kind invitation. It's delightful to be here to give this talk, billed as Death of a Canadian, the Corrosive Impacts of Authenticity. I'll start off with some formal remarks, if I might, for a couple of minutes. The pursuit of research on Canada is a foundational cornerstone of scholarly inquiry within academic circles in Canada, as well as throughout the international community. Indeed, a significant segment of Canada-oriented research and scholarship takes place beyond Canadian borders, and it takes place by Canadian expats, Canadian citizens who, as academics, work on Canada-focused issues and subjects in nations around the world. I'm one of these people, yet by all accounts, I should be dead. 37 years and counting abroad would be seemingly more than sufficient for the corrosive effects of authenticity to slowly but surely win out. Against the odds, however, I've professionally managed to survive and even from time to time successfully push back against the evil forces associated with authenticity. Now, what precisely do I mean by authenticity, and why does it unleash such painfully negative impacts for expat Canadians? My remarks this afternoon, arguably the most personal talk I've given in my life as part of the Bridgewater McGill-Plattsburgh Annual Lecture, focuses on two areas. First, what exactly is authenticity, and in what ways does it manifest itself to result in corrosive impacts on the professional life of Canadian scholars living abroad? And the second thing that I'll speak to today is I'll consider my own professional journey, or at least a truncated version of that, some of the difficulties I've encountered with authenticity, and the methods I've considered, pursued, and adopted. In doing so, I hope to identify strategies and actions that are available to Canadian expats to counter the challenges posed by authenticity. Therefore, the quote-unquote good news, if you will, is that there are indeed postures and remedies one can pursue and embrace in the face of authenticity. Unlike Willie Loman, who is despondent with life and effectively dead, my situation is far from that of Arthur Miller's protagonist in Death of a Salesman. That play, by the way, premiered in Broadway in February of '49. It was directed by the great director Elia Kazan, and it starred an actor who's widely underrated, Lee J. Cobb, but a great book, great play. Authenticity, if I could turn to that. You know, being real, true, the genuine thing. For academics, the very professional foundation of our DNA rests in large measure on our ability to be and to be perceived as authentic. The notion of authenticity, its linkage to expat Canadians and the ongoing challenges it poses, was first brought to my attention by a friend, colleague, and scholar, Eileen Blomrad, who recently left the University of California, Berkeley, did her undergrad here at McGill, PhD at Harvard, went out to Berkeley, starred out there. She's recently taken a wonderful chair out at the University of British Columbia. She was kind enough to contribute a chapter to the book volume that I co-edited with Richard Nimogene in 2022, this book here, The Construction of Canadian Identity from Abroad. Indeed, I want to be very forthcoming in saying the comments over the next few minutes in significant measure unashamedly borrow from Irene's essay. It was so good. The vexing nature of authenticity in U.S. academic, business, and government circles, and to a far greater degree in Canada itself, is profound. As Irene acutely observed, she writes, "What does a U.S.-based academic, especially one who is increasingly distanced from the experience of Canadian life, truly know about a country he or she no longer calls home? There are certainly benefits of distance and comparison. Sometimes the big picture is easier to see and articulate, but this can come at the cost of fine-grained details. With time, you are no longer an expat Canadian with some legitimacy to speak on Canada, but you become a Canadian immigrant in the United States, vulnerable to the criticism facing all immigrants, that of excessive nostalgia for the homeland and an understanding of Canada frozen in the moment when you left the country." So increasingly, as Irene suggests, as a fellow Canadian, I confront the fraught subject of authenticity that comes from being a Canadian expat, even as the years go by, in my case, nearly four decades. The longer I stay in the United States, arguably, the more American I am, regardless of my Canadian passport, which at one point I thought I misplaced today, and I've lost it several times, but never lost it. I've just misplaced it. This occurs with no conscious effort on my part. It creates fundamental challenges of authenticity. Being identified as a so-called Canadianist is not a problem within circles of American scholars. Given, dare I say, limited knowledge of Canada, even the most basic knowledge of Canadian society and current events makes you an expert. As must be the case for many expat scholars, when a colleague hears, as Irene phrased it, that I engage in research and scholarship on Canada, the near automatic response is, "Oh, are you Canadian?" A bigger problem emerges when it comes to authenticity among scholars and colleagues who study similar issues in Canada. After all, what does a US-based academic, even one with a Canadian passport, know about Canada? Part of the problem, as Irene suggested in her paragraph a moment ago, is the lack of lived experiences as the months and years outside of Canada add up. When I return, as I do, to Canada on a regular basis, I'd say about every 3 weeks, mostly to Montreal, or to attend conferences or to visit friends and family wherever they may be, these collective experiences are not the same as physically residing in a country. For me, after leaving Canada for the United States in 1987 to go to graduate school, my Canada was the one that existed around the time I left. My assumptions of the conventional wisdom, the experiences on the ground, and the feel of things arguably became more tenuous over time. And as one moves to embrace arguably a more permanent status outside of Canada, most of us move to the United States under a visa status, then you consider getting a green card, becoming a permanent resident alien, and God forbid you take the step of taking out U.S. citizenship. This process only reinforces the realities posed by authenticity. Yet, I want to suggest that not all is lost. Let's turn to look, if we can, at some of my professional experiences and the strategies I've considered at times pursued in an effort to make sure my voice has, for the most part, remained authentic. And before leaping to discuss some of my quote-unquote professional experiences, allow me to first, in a thumbnail sketch, suggest some of the strategies or remedies I, along with many other expats, have pursued when it comes to all things Canada-focused. This listing of pathways is by no means intended to be exhaustive. These are simply strategies I followed. When it comes to scholarly research and publications, there's a need to conduct original research in Canada. There's a need to focus on where and what you publish, both in journals and books that have a Canadian studies focus, if you will, as well as in publications that are well-regarded disciplinary-based publications. Networks of professional academics who work on Canada-focused materials, both within the world we know as Canadian studies and within one's discipline in the US, Canada, and internationally is important. To this end, working with top scholars who have excellent reputational value matters. And related to this, professional engagement with Canadian academic associations, not simply as a member, but playing a increasingly more significant role in the leadership of these groups matters. Another thing that I found that works is regularized engagement with or direct involvement and affiliation with a Canadian focused program at a college, university, or center, both in the United States, in Canada, and throughout various nations in the world. It matters. Occasionally, you have the opportunity, such as today, to offer you're offered a speaking engagement, you're offered teaching opportunities, you're offered visiting fellowships. To the extent that you embrace those, particularly at top-notch universities, that matters. Regular engagement with a variety of media sources. I don't have to, Daniel knows this all too well. But at the same time, it's important, if you're going to have authenticity, you have to know when to pass the baton. When a Canadian issue or subject comes your way for commentary and your knowledge happens to be veneer thin, recommend a colleague or colleagues who can speak authoritatively to the subject. And a small but not unimportant point is that expat scholars of Canada benefit more generally from the regular and relative ignorance about Canada abroad. Those are some of the factors that I've talked about. Now let me give you some of my experiences if I can. And Daniel, if you'll time me and let me know when I have 5 minutes left, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. So Canada, I want to tell you when I left when I left Kingston, Ontario to go down to Boston to do my PhD, let me assure you that Canada was not a focal point of intellectual activity for me. I was at Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts. I had gone, to make a long story short, I had gone through 2 dissertation proposals that were shot down. And that took me, about 8 months of my life. The second one, I shot it down myself because I was prepared to go in. I had the methodology. I had all the empirical evidence. I walked in, and the question was, why do certain states that have the capabilities to do so, why in the post-1945 period have they purposely chosen not to develop nuclear forces? I walk into the library that day, just before I'm about to go in and meet my dissertation committee, and I look at the new books on the shelf, and here's a contribution from a new professor at the University of Virginia. It's his PhD dissertation at Oxford. He has the same case studies, and he has the same methodology. And I was like, I can't do this. So as I was walking out that day, a bit dispirited, as you might imagine, one of my supervisors turned to me and said, look, why don't you take a look at something about Canadian-American relations? I remember you did something for your master's on that before you came here. And I wanted to exclaim, don't make the mistake because of thinking that I'm Canadian, that I should, let alone want to pursue work, not to mention 3 years of my life, researching and writing on Canada. But it was good advice. I quickly realized after going through the scholarly literature that this was not simply an exercise in covering familiar terrain, but most importantly, the source of a very fruitful research avenue. That research avenue was to ask why Canada, as a comparatively small state, scholars of international relations and foreign policy would predict in negotiations and bargaining with the great power, or a great power at the time, the United States, that when those negotiations and bargaining, regardless of subject area, trade, the environment, security, sovereignty, what have you, that Canada should get its ass kicked. That Canada should never, or should rarely, be able to secure its national interests. But when I looked at the work, and I looked at various case studies, and I wasn't cherry picking, it became abundantly clear that Canada did very well in negotiations with the United States. So it raised the question of why, which is the question all political scientists like. So anyway, but that approach, the notion that you needed to ground yourself in original research, has consistently over my professional life contributed to being viewed as authentic, right? That completion of that work in 1993 propelled me into my first full-time academic appointment as a tenure-track professor of political science and Canadian studies, of all things, at Bridgewater State College in Massachusetts. I had lived in Massachusetts at that time for 6 years. Never had I heard, because everything is so Boston-centric in Massachusetts, as it is Manhattan with New York. I never talked to anybody who'd heard of Bridgewater State. I had no idea where its physical location in the Commonwealth was. But after visiting the campus, interviewing for the job, I found myself walking on to an American undergraduate college that included, of all things, an international and area studies program founded in 1973, dedicated to Canadian studies. Who would have guessed? And over the next 9 years, Canada proved to be front and center in my professional life in a variety of ways. As an instructor to groups of undergraduate students in courses ranging from Canadian foreign policy to Canada-US relations, Canadian government, as a researcher working on new fruitful topics while always in search of research grants, as a colleague determined to promote a deeper understanding of Canada through a variety of program efforts on campus, and by being engaged in Canadian studies activities. And during my time at Bridgewater, I also had the good fortune for 3+ years to serve as the Canadian Mine Action Scholar in Residence. This role, which was based at the Canadian Consulate General in Boston, afforded me an opportunity to travel across the United States to lead public forums offering lectures on the 1997 Convention to Ban Anti-Personnel Mines, a convention that Canada had successfully worked to realize. When I went to the folks at Foreign Affairs in Canada who worked for Lloyd Axworthy when this was initially set up, they were very supportive of this, and they were very supportive of the fact that I had no intention of going around the United States talking to World Affairs Councils or talking at universities in a way that would be an exercise, a jingoistic exercise in pom-pom waving at, look at Canada, look how great Canada is. I had no interest in that. I'm an academic. I look at, nor was I interested in poking my finger in Uncle Sam's eye, because as many of you know, the United States chose not to support, for various reasons, that particular convention. But it was a wonderful time, and during that period, I was actually offered a position for over 10 years, as it turned out, at the Human Rights and Humanitarian Policy Program at Columbia, where I was offered the opportunity annually to go in and offer a graduate course to MA and PhD students to talk about a variety of things, which of course included Canada and the Landmine Convention, if you will, or the Mine Ban Convention. A little over 20 years ago, in August of 2002, I accepted the position of Director of the Center for the Study of Canada at the State University of New York in Plattsburgh. This position situated me in a role that constantly required me to, first and foremost, as it did for Daniel when he came from Saskatchewan to MISC, to consider the needs and program initiatives of a highly regarded, internationally recognized Canadian Studies Center in the U.S. A Canadian-focused academic program was launched in Plattsburgh, at SUNY Plattsburgh, in 1966. And it was followed by the establishment of the center in 1975 by two wonderful individuals who led it for years, Richard Beach and Gene Kistner. And during that period, SUNY Plattsburgh's center emerged as arguably one of the most prominent university-based initiatives on Canada and the nation. So I find myself in 2002 occupying another platform that demanded authenticity, but somewhat ironically, simultaneously also conferred on authenticity on me as its director. And it didn't take long. While there was a solid foundation in place at the center, there were also notable challenges to address, including the need to revitalize or jettison dated programming and how best to conceive of, finance, and, dare I say, launch dynamic new initiatives anchored around Canada. Much like Daniel, a core function of the director's job at Plattsburgh rests with identifying and securing external funding to support any and all program initiatives. Everything from speaker series to distinguished addresses, exchange programs, authors' workshops, conferences, and you name it. I'll never forget, around 2011 or 12, the president of the college at the time, our university, was kind enough to host a reception and dinner at his house for about 20 individuals. One of the faculty members at SUNY Plattsburgh, who's still there, so I won't name this person, came up to me at one point and she says, "Chris, isn't this amazing?" She says, "We're here tonight. Look at the meal that we're having and all the hors d'oeuvres and the great wine and everything." And I pulled this person aside for a second and I said, I'll use a pseudonym here. "Barbara, do you know that canapé you ate and that sauterne you had with dinner and the crepe Suzette and the beef Wellington and all the other stuff?" I said, "Who do you think paid for that?" And she said, "Well, the president." I said, "No, the Center for the Study of Canada paid for that." I said, "The president is kind enough, along with his wife, to open up their home to us tonight and to allow us to host this event in a wonderful setting. But never forget, you always have to have money to do things, and sometimes they get lost in translation. It's true. So the center for years and years, much like many Canadian studies programs in the United States and internationally, we used to be able to count on the Government of Canada, the Global Affairs Canada, to provide funding of about $6 million globally to support research, to support the development of new courses, to support conferences, to even support K through 12 program activities. That all vanished in 2012. John Baird, under Stephen Harper's government, was the Minister of Foreign Affairs and just thought it was extraneous expenses and didn't need to be, thought it was a poor choice of funding. So that sort of drifted away. But the truth is, you've got to find other sources, and to keep up the center's reputation and to confirm and reaffirm our legitimacy and authenticity, we've had to reach out, and we've been successful in a variety of forces with the Office of Global Affairs at SUNY System, with the United States Department of State, Fulbright Canada, and other sources. So perhaps the most important over the past 40 plus years is that we're recognized as only one of two national resource centers in the United States, which is the U.S. Department of Education's Higher Education Division. It's the Academy Award. It's the Oscar. In other words, you are not simply doing nice things on your campus, but you have a national mandate to do things. And I'm very proud that we've done that. We also, another program that if I can just briefly mention that we launched, which I did with my colleague who's now retired from the University of Vermont, Andre Seneca, we launched a program in 2003 called Connect. It was very obvious in the world of Canadian studies that we occupied, whether you were going to a conference, whether you were meeting other friends and colleagues, that the professoriate was aging and was, when you looked around a room, if you could find two people under 35, you were lucky. And so we recognized that there was a crisis afoot, and in 2003, with the support of Global Affairs or Foreign Affairs Canada, we launched this program called Connect. And it was, in terms of program initiatives, not scholarship, but program initiatives, it was the highlight of my professional life. Why? Because for about 13 years, we were able to reach out and instead of taking a passive method, which most academic national associations, such as the Association for Canadian Studies in the United States, ACSIS, had always done, they sort of had that mentality of, oh, we've built it, they will come. And we thought that was completely the wrong way to think about things. We desperately needed new individuals, and I mean people who were PhD candidates and freshly minted professors, because we were trying to institutionalize the presence of Canada in terms of its teaching and research on American campuses, both public and private. And every year we would comb the country proactively. We had about 30 different research methods that we employed, and what we would typically find is 75 to 100 individuals, and we would narrow that list down every year to of that 75 to 100 individuals, we would simply go through them carefully and sort of look, and I had the funnest job for a stretch when we did this, because we would go pick one of these 30 methods. We would, in some cases, it was reaching out to the academic relations officers at the then 18 Canadian consulates general around the United States saying, hey, is there anybody in your program? At times, it was looking at who had just printed or who had just published and finished a PhD with Canadian content. At other times, it was looking through about 40 volumes of university press publications to see what was new on Canada. And we would call somebody up and say, hi, I understand, you're in the PhD program in international economics at Stanford, and part of your dissertation focuses on Canada. And they'd say, who are you and how do you know that? And it was wonderful because we did our homework. We got an A on research for this. And we would take 20 of these individuals each year up to Ottawa for a week-long conference, and a networking opportunity for them so that they could see what the possibilities in terms of publications, in terms of grants, in terms of colleagues were, networks, so they could give them a little boost, right? These were what we considered the 20 most promising individuals. I'm very proud to say a number of those folks are still deeply engaged in the United States at universities and colleges all over the place on Canada. It was just a terrifically positive thing to do. And, when they left, like I said, we had about 75 each year, including the 20 who came to Ottawa. So did we just say hi? We said no. We said, hi, you're in Connect, and this is what Connect means. So think of this. Every 6 months, you would walk into your office and you would open your email that morning and you would find an email from Connect. You're an anthropology PhD student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. There would be an attachment. You would open that attachment, and in that attachment would be what? What would be in there? I'll tell you what was in there. All the leading journal and book publications in your discipline on Canada published in the last 6 months. What would be in there would be all the conferences, all the grant opportunities. It was amazing. It was one-stop shopping. That's what we wanted to provide for these people, in the sense that we're trying to inculcate you in the world of Canada, right? So we need to deliver the product. And there was a number of other things in there as well. But the truth is, it was when we would send out these mentoring dossiers, as we called them, it was so nice to be able to do that for people. And we did that through, I'm pleased to say, even after the money was cut off from Ottawa, we did this through 2014. And I want to talk, if I can, for a moment, about one final significant platform that I've utilized to stave off the challenge of authenticity. I've been driven over the years to focus on as expansive and inclusive a range of multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary approaches to Canada as possible, and to purposely do it by forging relationships with other academic actors, programs, affiliated organizations, and more often than not, with scholars in Canada. I mean, our relationships are pretty deep. Stéphane Gervais and I, along with our late colleague Jarrett Rudy, offered 2 versions of a book on Quebec questions with Oxford, and it was the most multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary experience one could imagine. I do international relations. I do foreign policy, and I published a bunch on that. But it's also necessary to reach out. I was saying to Stéphane and Marianne a moment ago, we've got a book coming out this fall with McGill Queen's. It'll be the first, me, Andrew Holman, and my colleague Cheryl Gosselin at Bishop's, first multidisciplinary comprehensive text on the Eastern Townships. I'm doing a project with 2 colleagues at ENAP and UQAM on Quebec-US relations. The book's coming out en anglais with Paul Gray Macmillan and en français with Presse Université Laval. So you've got to, you know, I've always believed you've got to cast your net wide and to work with really talented networks and scholars, including, as I suggest, my colleagues here at McGill. I won't go through the long laundry list. But the nice part about working and with as broad a group as you can is that the very truth is that at the end of the day, these partnerships deliver and they result in important dividends. And, you know, when people used to come to me and say, well, why are you working with the College of Social Sciences at the University of Hawaii at Manoa? Why is there a Canada colloquium in Hawaii? Oh, we always had an answer for that, of course. But, you know, it wasn't just Hawaii. We've worked closely with UC Berkeley, with the Center for International Affairs at Harvard, a lot of schools. So it's been important. And as I say, I've managed to help contribute in small part to publications on a variety of topics that are pretty, when I think back at my age, of things that I've helped champion on Canada's military engagement in Afghanistan, Canada in a unipolar world, the year 1968 in Canada, and its impacts on the country, Indigenous peoples in Canada and the United States, American foreign policy toward Canada under Donald Trump, Quebec society, Quebec's engagement with the international community. I even wrote a chapter on the ice cider industry in Quebec. It's amazing. I mean, you know, I've had the lucky footing of my life to say, yes, I'm a political scientist, but I also have to run this center that focuses on Canada and Quebec. In fact, when I got to Plattsburgh in 2002, it was very apparent to me that a lot of the program initiatives and a lot of the research and, to some degree, publications that had been undertaken by the faculty were very Quebec-focused, and that it was necessary to launch a separate, co-equal, if you will, institute focused on Quebec that would also deliver an academic program for students. And then I think maybe I think back to when I interviewed for my job there. The then president, it was my last interview of the day, a warm June day of 2002. I walked into his office and he asked me a series of standard questions. And then towards the end of the conversation, he threw this one out at me. And I paused for a minute because I didn't know if he was pulling my leg or if he was sort of testing me to see how I would respond. And his answer was, or his observation / question was, you know, we do a heck of a lot of stuff on Quebec around here. He says, why is it always Quebec, Quebec, Quebec? He says, why aren't we, for example, looking at Saskatchewan? I don't think I've ever told Daniel the story. And I thought, and I paused for a moment, and I said, well, you know, Saskatchewan's a lovely province, and there's a lot of compelling reasons to look at other places like Saskatchewan, but there's this thing called comparative advantage. And we have a group of faculty and students, and the fact that we're 25 minutes from the border, and the fact that we're about an hour, depending on how quickly you get through the border, and the construction leading up to Montreal, and in Montreal, which is probably the largest single variable. The truth is, there's reasons, compelling reasons, why we need to focus on Quebec. So that never left me, you know. I knew we would never launch, with all due respect to anybody from Saskatchewan here, the Institute on Saskatchewan Studies. I was in full interest of disclosure as a kid, I was an enormous Saskatchewan Roughriders fan. The only one probably in the province of Ontario, but anyway, but that goes back to the 70s, so that's a long time ago. Let me offer some concluding remarks. It's been a long day and a warm day, and I greatly appreciate you being here. Unlike 63-year-old Willie Loman, who is often characterized as unstable, insecure, and self-deluded, and who, towards the end of Arthur Miller's play, crashes his car and dies, I'm relieved to say that my professional voyage as an expat Canadian academic, while encountering a few potholes over the years, has, to date, proven to be rewarding. The very real challenges periodically brought on by authenticity have not, I believe I've suggested this afternoon, proven fatal. The reality of authenticity is nicely captured in this passage from Mordecai Richler's 1984 book, Home Sweet Home, My Canadian Album. And Richler wrote, saying, "Certainly, I had sailed away from Canada without regrets in 1951. Like many of my contemporaries, I was mistakenly charged with scorn for all things Canadian. For the truth is, if we were indeed hemmed in by the boring, the inane, and the absurd, we foolishly blamed it all on Canada, failing to grasp that we would suffer from a surfeit of the boring, the inane, and the absurd wherever we eventually settled, and would carry Canada with us for good measure. To remain relevant and visible, there has been and will always be a constant need to recognize, as Richler suggests, the unrelenting pull of Canada. One must be prepared to wade into the deep end, so to speak, even if your aquatic skills are less than fully polished. Spatial dislocation, I remember when Richard Nemegene threw that term out to me, and I know it's a geographer's term. I was like, wow, that's a funky term, but it's a great term. Spatial dislocation, by its very nature, fuels the fires of authenticity. There is no way, to be entirely candid, to vanquish these abrasive forces. Yet, there are pathways one can seek out and embrace that effectively prevent the unrelenting fires from singeing, let alone burning one. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.